I guess we'll start. I'm Alison Meadow. I'm an associate research professor in our brand new named department, the Arizona Institutes for Resilience. I have a background in environmental anthropology, climate change adaptation and planning, community-based research methods, and project and program evaluation. When you kind of meld all of those together, that's really how I came to the topic of societal impacts and how we can think about the way that we're doing our research in an academic setting so that it's maximizing the impacts and the engagement that we have with our community partners, whether that's municipalities, natural resource managers, all the way up to policymakers. So that's a little bit of my background, and I'll let Gigi introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Gigi, Owen, and I am a social scientist researcher with the Climate Assessment for the Southwest, which is funded through the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. So it's a NOAA-funded climate research program that focuses on collaborative partnerships with people in the Southwest community to kind of work towards climate adaptation and climate resilience. And part of my research there is running the evaluation efforts for the CLIMAS team. So that has really shaped a lot of my experience in thinking about how to better identify and document the societal impacts of academic research.
Thanks. Well, with that, we'll get started. I'll tell you a bit about what we are going to do today. A little bit of an outline. We're going to try to cover 4 topics. The bulk of our discussion will be towards the end. But we're going to just provide a bit of an introduction to this term, societal impacts, and what we mean, and some of the definitions out there. A bit of an overview of how we get to those with our research. How do we make those societal changes? Why should we document them? Hopefully you guys all have your own reasons because you're here, but we'll kind of walk through some of the common uses for this kind of reporting. And then we're going to spend some time really walking through a process that we've been developing that we think can be really helpful in documenting, in identifying, and really sort of crafting the way that you talk about your research. Even though we're online, we are going to try to integrate some discussion throughout this. So sort of at the end of each one of these 4 topic areas, we're going to pause and ask some questions. And at that point, definitely feel free to type into the chat box and just respond to us or ask for clarification on anything. And you're really welcome to do that throughout, but we will have some kind of key questions as we go. All right. What are societal impacts? We're working from this definition that societal impacts are the ways that your research or the process of conducting your research, such as engaging with community members and decision makers, has influenced the world beyond academia. I think that we all, or many of us anyway, most of us, got into this business because we would like to see our research have big impact in the world. We want to make a contribution to our environment, to our society in terms of bringing about positive changes. So sometimes when we start talking about societal impacts, we go immediately to those big scale changes. You know, I want to see this city really adapting to climate change. I want an organization to overhaul its hiring practices to be far more equitable. We want to see schools adopting new teaching techniques, new curriculum, because our research shows that it's better. Those are really large scale changes. Those are really important. They're particularly important to motivate those of us who want to do that kind of work. What we're going to focus on today is some shorter and midterm indicators that you're getting to those big changes. The challenge with those big changes is sometimes they take a really long time to get there. And your research may be one part of that process and a part of a much bigger whole. So what we're going to focus on today is some nearer term indicators that you can use to say, hey, I think we are heading in the right direction. I am starting starting to see evidence that this is going to have big change in the long term. So this is the kind of tool, the kind of process that you can use more at your individual project scale, evaluation and reporting. You know, maybe you've got 2 or 3 years of funding, maybe you're lucky enough to have 5 years of funding. These are the kinds of impacts that we expect to see in that time frame. So that's going to be our focus today, which is not to take away from the big motivational, big change kinds of impacts. It's just that we want to show some steps to get there. So we're going to talk using these 4 broad categories today. And I want to stress these are not the only way to talk about societal impacts. There are other categories out there. There's other terms out there. After a lot of work, we decided that these were pretty robust. They seemed to capture the vast majority of impacts that we were seeing. We could fit into each of these categories, but don't feel like you are locked into exactly these words. Use them as a tool. Okay, so the 4 categories that we're going to be focusing on today are instrumental impacts, and that means that your research has led to some tangible changes, such as in plans, in decisions, in practices, or policies. So you can kind of draw a link between the work that you did and some identifiable changes in the folks that you're working with. Conceptual impacts, your research has contributed to changes in people's knowledge about or awareness of an issue. So that's sort of like a little bit of the hearts and minds. Yeah, people are understanding this better. They are much more aware of this issue in their lives. Capacity building. Your research contributed to enhancing the skills, expertise, or resources of an organization or group of people. You might see this more through your research process, where maybe people are gaining more new skills, more ability to do things. So that's a really important impact. And connectivity is the last one, and we feel like sometimes this is overlooked. If your research or again the process has led to new or strengthened relationships, partnerships, networks that endure after the project ends, that is another really great indicator that there's a good possibility of future change. So connectivity, think about how you're bringing people together. I want to stress, these are not hierarchical categories. No, none is better than the other. They actually really interact a lot with each other and support each other, and all can contribute towards those large scale big changes that we're talking about, or that sort of our aspirational changes. So don't feel like, oh, because a plan didn't change or a policy didn't change, that was not an impact. These all work together. Oops, sorry, I moved one step too far.
Great. So we're going to go through some examples of what societal impacts of research look like when they're split into these categories. So for example, here's one that states that we worked with the staff of the local wildlife management agency and introduced them to a new sampling technique that they hadn't used before. They told us it was more accurate than the method that they usually use, and they changed their protocol to incorporate this new technique. So this statement here demonstrates a combination of both capacity building, so the agency staff learned and practiced this new sampling technique, and an instrumental application as the agency staff incorporated this new skill into their regular management practices.
In another example, a group of city planners met for the first time at a workshop that we held as part of our project. After the workshop, the group began meeting regularly to collaborate on a funding proposal for their city. They continued to invite me, the researcher, to attend their meetings, which I do on a regular basis. So this is a nice example of a connectivity impact. So we know that this building of networks that include both practitioners and stakeholders can really help make that research more useful in the long term. So if you start to see those kinds of relationships developing, that's a nice impact to document.
Right, another example, 3 graduate students from backgrounds often underrepresented in the STEM fields participated in this project. They gained data collection, analysis, and project management skills participated in the writing of 4 academic papers, and all 3 were accepted into postdoctoral programs in this field. So this really fits nicely under the capacity building category, as the 3 students' skills, expertise, and employment opportunities were all expanded by participating in this project.
In this example, we see health professionals who participated in this project reported that they understood the science behind regional temperature projections much better than when the project started. 2 of these professionals took the initiative to present the findings of our research to an internal group in their health center in order to explain the research methods and findings to their colleagues. So this is a nice example of both conceptual impacts and capacity building. So we see our practitioner partners really understanding the science, understanding the methods that were used to produce the research findings, and feeling so good about it that they felt they had the capacity to then explain those to others. So conceptual impacts, their beliefs and understanding change, and they felt confident in sharing that with others, an indication that their capacity has increased.
And here's another example of an instrumental application. Our research confirmed that even with updated sea level rise projections, an existing seawall should be adequate for at least the next 50 years. The local planning agency used our analysis in their flood plan, and they noted, "These results give greater certainty that we have been planning for the right potential range of water levels this century." The agency also included in the flood plan a provision to revisit the sea level rise projections every 5 years as the science improves so that they can plan ahead. So here, even though the research didn't cause the agency to necessarily change their course of action, it instilled confidence in their already established course of action. So that still represents an application of the research findings to their flood planning efforts. And so again, we want to go back and point to the differentiation between the types of impacts that we're talking about today and some of these other longer term impacts of research, or the ways that your research will contribute to long-term measurable changes. So in the case of this seawall, for example, we'll say that 25 years later, sea level rise of 1 meter occurred, but the coastal seawall prevented any flooding from happening in the city. So this prevention, as well as other actions in the hazard mitigation plan, saved the city $5 million in damages, amongst other savings. So in this case, you know, I think the main thing is like, this is much longer term in the future. So unless you really have a long-term monitoring and evaluation system in place, you may never hear about or know about these types of longer term impacts, as they really typically extend beyond the time frame of your project. So, and again, this type of longer term impact evaluation may be a topic that we'll cover in future workshops if there's interest. But again, for today, we're kind of focusing on these other 4 near term categories of impact.
So we'd love to hear from you for a minute. Again, we wish that we could see you all in person, but if you have some examples of societal impacts from your own research, or you can think of ways that the categories that, as we've described, might apply to your own research, toss them in the chat box for us. We'd love to just see what you guys are thinking about. Or some ideas may pop up as we move along through here. So if you're feeling stumped just at the moment, don't feel pressure. It's okay. All right. Feel free to jump in. We're gonna keep moving along, but feel free to drop in questions and ideas as we go.
Great. So moving on to, how do you get to societal impacts through your research? There are several pathways from research to societal impact, but a lot of times they can generally flow in this structure here. So number one, you do good research. That's your baseline key. You got to do good, solid research. Number two, that research connects to society. Three, societal partners use that research. And then four, that research changes something for a person, organization, community, or ecosystem. And one of the main points of divergence along this pathway revolves around this point number two, how that research connects to society.
Sorry, got to move that.
So this can be through indirect interactions with society. So for example, someone finds your research in a book, an academic journal, a technical report, through news media or online, and then uses it to address their needs.
Sorry, the little button isn't working super well today. Okay. The other way that that your research gets to the people who use it and who need it is through these direct interactions with society. So some of some examples, these are not exclusive, but you might have direct engagement with key decision makers and practitioners, visiting them in their place of work or community, collecting and analyzing data together. You might present your findings straight to your stakeholders or to the public. You might provide professional advice or expert testimony. Those are all direct links between your research and the people who might need it to make decisions. Can also be that your research is used by another research group or other colleagues who are interacting directly. And as we've pointed out with some of the capacity building is if an organization builds its capacity through its interaction with you, they might then be able to go on and do something else. You might not be directly involved, but you've contributed by helping them build some capacity. I'm going to pause real quick because we do have a couple of nice examples that came in. So crafting tools for climate adaptation project implementers or indicators for adaptation assessment that are presented at workshops, and that is a case of capacity building and maybe conceptual impact. I think that's the case. What we're going to try to do is show you some ways to think about how to document that. But I think both of those outcomes seem quite likely from that. Measuring the number of people who've taken the online training courses and tracking the number of times that media has used our products. Yeah, so that's really nice examples of capacity building, people who are engaging with your organization, gaining new skills. Participation in scientific councils. Yeah, if you're able to connect directly with policymakers through something like a scientific council and you feeling like you can get your information to them, absolutely. How do you know whether they use it? Excellent question. We're going to get to some examples of data, the kinds of data that you can collect that we hope is not going to be super onerous, ways to follow up, ways to think about how to document this as we go. Okay, before we launch into some of those documentation and stuff, I guess just one other note of caution is, and I touched on this a little bit earlier when we talked about those big changes that we would all love to see. Impact is rarely a straight line. Most likely your research is going to be one of several factors that have influenced a big change. It's rarely the only factor. So that we can think about this as sort of a winding road, this little metaphor of a winding road. You're starting with your research question. You and your partners are engaging, you're talking, you're probably refining the question. So there's some influence of their interests and their needs along with your question and your needs. That process and your research findings may help people view the question in a new way, kind of that new understanding. Maybe that new understanding leads them to read more about it, get even more information, and that may further refine their thinking. maybe that leads to a recognition that folks need new skills to really be able to take this on. So you've got a little bit of a diversion while people do some capacity building. Maybe you're even involved in that. That can lead then to some changes in practice, and then we move down the road to impacts. Our point here is that you're part of sort of an ecosystem of change here. You are helping to move things along, but it's not a straight line. It's rarely a straight line between I did this and then this changed. So we do want to keep our eye on all of those moving parts and think about that winding road and how things have progressed as you moved. But to the point of today's work, if we're looking for some of those early and midterm indicators, then we can start to say, hey, I have some evidence of impact, and I'm feeling increasingly confident about the way that I have contributed to this big process. So contributing to a big change is a positive impact and worth describing. Whether or not you can take 100% credit for it shouldn't matter. You're part of the process of change. Okay. Why should we do this? Why should we document this stuff? It's a good question. A very practical reason is that a number of funders are starting to be very interested in your impacts beyond academia. NSF is a great example. They have a very robust broader impacts section of their proposals, where they're looking particularly at issues of full participation in STEM fields, improving STEM education, increasing economic competitiveness. So thinking about those categories. So not just your research question, but how your research is affecting things outside of your particular grant. So NSF has been one of the drivers of thinking about this a little bit differently. They are not the only funder by far. A few other examples Gigi already mentioned. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, through the Regional Integrated Science and Assessments Program, was also an early adopter of the idea that we should be able to see societal impacts. They might not have been using that term, but those were some of the underlying ideas. Also through their National Estuary and I can never say that word, research reserve system, and a number of other agencies are starting to move in that direction and asking to see societal impacts. Show us how you're going to do these things. Show us how you're going to engage with practitioners and stakeholders. There are some other reasons. You might be asked to explain your research to policymakers, and they might want to know how you are contributing to state or local communities. Being able to craft a statement and feel confident that you've had these kinds of impacts can really help you there. Same goes for if you're speaking at a public meeting, particularly if you're hoping to include that community in your research, being able to really demonstrate, hey, this is the kind of work that I do. These are the kinds of changes I've helped other communities or other stakeholders with. That's a good way to establish your credibility and build relationships. You probably want to be able to convince your dean or director that you are amazing and that you have these particular skills. And so again, having some tools, having some language to use can kind of help that process along. On that note, starting to see more departments and universities incorporating things like outreach and starting to talk about broader societal impacts in promotion and tenure and performance review. It's not super common, but it is growing. And what we're hoping is we're setting you up for being able to do that easily when the time comes. So again, we're just curious if you have some experience with writing up broader impacts or societal impact sections in proposals and what some of your challenges have been. I think we'll probably, in the interest of time, we'll probably keep moving along. But again, feel free to jot down some ideas as we go, because we do want to get to the tools that we think can help.
There are a couple.
Oh yeah, okay. So not wanting to claim too much credit for outcomes. I think that's fair. I think that's exactly what we've been trying to say, is that that we like to think of this as work. You know, most likely you are contributing to a change, but if we can focus on some examples of short and midterm indicators of change that you can feel really confident about, I think that's a nice way to say, I know that I had this kind of impact. And we also know from previous studies, from other research, that these kinds of midterm impacts tend to contribute to long-term, even if we're not able to see 10 years, 15 years into the future. I can say, yeah, we did start to see these things happening. Qualitative and quantitative evidence is, yep, kind of a constant one. We're going to stick with qualitative today. Yes, people wanting to see dollar impact. That's going to be that's a big societal change that needs to happen. And I think there's many of us trying to work on that. What we like to think is that the more that we can rigorously document these, even in a qualitative sense, some of these impacts, that we might start to get to the point where we can move beyond a strictly economic impact model. We're not going to get into it today, but if anybody is interested in this, a number of European and in the UK, Australia, New Zealand, there are a number of countries that have really shifted to this kind of model of reporting for academic impacts. And that, for me anyway, gives me some hope that we will see a change from a strictly economic reporting to something that recognizes that many societal impacts do not break down to dollars and cents, but can be documented in different ways. Gigi, are there any other ones that you caught?
Yeah. I think there were a few other kinds of difficulties about, there's one is how specific do you need to be when writing about this social impacts of your research? And I think a related one is sometimes in broader impact sections, it seems very aspirational, and the relationships that you develop over research really direct your project's impact. And so it can be hard to fully map out beforehand. And I think those, both of those are really good points of kind of doing this at the beginning of a project and putting it into a proposal is going to probably look very different than what you come out with at the end, kind of following that curved path. I think you should, there should be room, especially if you're doing collaborative work with research partners, there should be room to kind of adjust course for some of those twists and turns. But I do think it's a valuable process to go through some of this beforehand when you are doing your research design, so that you can kind of put in pieces of like, how are you going to collect evidence towards some of these impacts, as well as just even kind of like thinking through, it can be really good for self-reflection. So if I'm thinking how I imagine or expect, what are my expectations for this project? How do I expect it to happen? And then you can kind of see how it plays out. It's a really nice comparison to be able to go back to and kind of reflect on, how did I think this was going to happen? And then what actually happened? And are there places that I could have changed things in order to meet other expectations? Or like you can really learn about your own research process that way.
Good. We did have one other that came through the Q&A. I have to remember to check that one. finding it difficult to talk about the impact of the project because it focuses on pre-modern Japan and not sure how relatable it can be. I think this is a really nice place to stop and think about how you might be able to take your own expertise and some of the support that you get through research funding, or just that you have some skills to share with perhaps it's community groups. Maybe I'm wondering, maybe high school history classes might benefit from your expertise, so that you're using some of your knowledge and some of your resources from the university to get out to a broader audience, and bringing some of your expertise, sharing it that way. So it doesn't always have to be that your exact research question revolves entirely around your impact, but that you're thinking about ways that you can incorporate a broader view of your research, and how to share your research with different audiences, as a nice way to think about both capacity building, conceptual impacts, really just changing people's understanding of a particular point in history, a particular culture. So, okay. Okay, why don't we go through the idea of crafting a case study, where we're going to share some tools and some structures.
Cool. Right, so I think the way that we're walking through this is looking at a project that already happened, so we have some of these kind of outcomes to draw on. Another way to use this to kind of get at some of the, if you're writing this into a broader impact section of a proposal, would be to kind of shift this around and think about like these questions in what do I want to do, or what will I do, or what do I plan to do. So I think it can kind of be used in both those ways. But today we're kind of looking, it's like we're at the end of the project and we're looking back and how do we fit some of these things into some outcomes categories. And I'll add that while we're presenting this in a fairly linear fashion, it might not work that way when you're actually working through this. So as you are thinking or working through one step, you may realize that you actually need to go back and refine or clarify or add something to a previous step. So just kind of keep that in mind as we're linearly walking through this. Okay, so I'm gonna first introduce the overall structure, and then we're gonna work through a case study example. And so for those of you who have used logic models before, the structure will look pretty familiar. We're starting with the question, what societal problem did you aim to address in your research? Then, how did you try to address it? So what actions and activities did you do, and how did you engage with your partners? Third, what were your outputs, or the tangible products or things that you produced in your project? And then at this point, it may be helpful to kind of link certain activities with an associated output. So for example, if you did a workshop, did that link to then a publication of a workshop report or something like that? Then we'll look at impacts. So again, conceptual impacts, new knowledge or awareness gained, connectivity impacts, partnerships established or strengthened, capacity building, skills or expertise that is strengthened or acquired, and instrumental impacts, direct applications of your research to decisions, policy, or practice. And then you want to think about what changed, but then to call out specifically for whom did things change. And then you might go back and link some of the specific activities and outputs to their impacts. So kind of linking together what led to what, more or less. Let's see. And then you'll kind of go back to maybe thinking about some of the inputs that enabled you to conduct your research. So things like resources, skills, and existing relationships. And then you might write down some of the components of the local context in which your research took place. So like what social, environmental, and political factors either facilitated or inhibited your research. And then you can kind of circle back and look at how some of the impacts connected back to some of those enabling factors. And this part is especially helpful for project reflection and learning lessons of what to bring with you into future research projects, or what would you like to change. And then also, just one little brief thing is you can then kind of see, do those impacts actually connect and go back and address that societal problem that you initially stated?
Okay, so we've got a little case study just to illustrate how all of those components sort of come together. So we're starting with this: what societal problem did you aim to address in your research? So you want to summarize this as concisely as possible. This statement's going to be different from your research question. Your research might be a much more narrow technical focus, but this is sort of what big problem did you want to solve? So in our case study, a tropical storm caused major flooding in a neighborhood of the city of Floodville. Ocean water breached the existing coastal wall, leading the city's planners and emergency managers to question whether they had the most accurate projections for sea level rise. They wanted to do up-to-date sea level rise. They wanted up-to-date sea level rise information so they could make better informed policies and decisions for the future of the city. We've got a crisis situation. We've got city officials saying, we don't have enough information to move forward. We need this kind of information. And that's how our researchers got involved.
All right, so then what actions did you take to address this issue? So here you'll want to state your methods briefly to give a sense of the kind of research that you did, and then provide a description of your approach to societal engagement and what activities did that involve. So in this case, in Floodville, scientific activities included data collection and analysis about sea level rise projections, and tailoring those to the right spatial and temporal scales for the city. Some engagement activities included attending meetings with city planners and emergency managers, giving presentations at those meetings, and then also having regular email and phone conversations with city officials, planners, and managers. You also attended community association meetings about the flood and about flood relief. So throughout this 2-year project, you updated managers, the emergency managers, planners, and these community members about your progress with your data and analysis. And you provided city officials and community members with maps and summaries of the analysis.
Okay, so the kinds of outputs we said, and this is a nice place you might briefly summarize your research findings. Remember, this isn't a research report. We're presuming that you're reporting on the detailed research findings someplace else, but using those research findings to kind of set up what else you did. So what the project, in this case, produced. So the researchers found that the city's current seawall was not high enough for these projected sea level rises, and they did provide estimates to inform the height of a new seawall. They produced some very specific climate projections for the greater Floodville region. They provided maps of the sea level rise in greater Floodville. And importantly, those maps complied with FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Association data standards, so that they could easily be used in the city's planning documents. They did a number of presentations. They produced sort of presentations that summarized the research findings, and some 2-page fact sheets for community audiences. So kind of a list of things. There are a number of different sort of tangible research outputs that you might produce that can help to drive the kinds of impacts that we're talking about. This is the tricky part. We don't want to stop with just what you produced and say, great, I did these, I came out with a report, I came out with the maps. We want to see if we can link those to some of these impacts. What changed because of your work? So I'm just moving to this one. So in this case study, the researchers found some conceptual impacts. That idea of like changing knowledge, changing understanding of the issue. Oh, they got emails from the city council about an increased understanding about the risks of sea level rise. Noted that community members were asking increasingly in-depth questions about the impacts that they might face, and they were using that to think about new ways that they would prepare for flood. So the researchers were really noting some changes in attitudes and changes in understanding. In the connectivity impact section. Really noted some new relationships being built with city planners and community members, and the researchers already had some relationships with emergency managers, but really noted there's some strengthening there. City planners invited researchers to do a new project in a related area of green infrastructure. And the city keeps calling to ask about presentations and other outreach activities. So some real evidence that we've got these connectivity impacts. Capacity building, similar to one of our earlier examples, a city council member used the PowerPoint presentation to present to another city that had recently flooded. So really demonstrating a capacity to understand and use and apply the science. And the government staff were given time to learn a new GIS skill that gave them a lot more facility to use the new maps and develop some new maps. So city staff worked with the researchers to develop this new skill set. And finally, we had some instrumental impacts in the form of those new maps and the new information were used in the city's multi-hazard mitigation plan. And importantly, that plan was accepted by the Federal Emergency Management Administration. So it really became official policy. All right, getting on to the how do you know. So we tried to give you kind of a bunch of different examples of impacts. Some of these may have more stringent data that you wanted to collect, but one of the points that we want to make is that some of this doesn't have to be heavy, in-depth evaluation work. Sometimes you can note, as our example did, you can get feedback from the folks that you're working with. And that's a great way to document some conceptual impacts, capacity building impacts. When you start to get, maybe you get formal, like a letter of recommendation or a letter of partnership that really says, oh, I really liked working with this person, I learned a lot, you know, that more sort of a more formal documentation. Emails, phone calls, other interactions can be great, relatively informal examples that do demonstrate that you've made a connection, that people are understanding the work, and that their minds are changing. So keep those things. They can be really helpful. You might see reference to your work in a management or policy document, as our case study demonstrated. You could look at citations of the work. I've had some pretty decent luck using Google Scholar to do some bibliometric searching to see if a published paper shows up in a management document. You can also keep asking people, or if you're still engaged in the process, you might know about the policy document that comes out. Save that citation, save a copy of that. It's a nice example that your work has been used. If you're working with general public, you might have some audience surveys. You know, you can come up with some quick and easy kinds of surveys to see how people are sort of taking in the information that you're providing. You might get emails or other forms of engagement like phone calls from the general public. Maybe somebody hears you talk, follows up with you. Media interviews, reference to your work. I think somebody may have mentioned that in our chat earlier, keeping track of when the media does pick up on things. You might be fortunate enough to have built in an evaluation plan in your research. This is very common if you're doing a large scale center multi-year kind of grant. A formal evaluation may be required in that case. Then you might have evidence, like you could even have randomized control trials if you have a big enough project and a robust enough evaluation plan. Smaller scale things, you may have pre and post tests, seeing how people's understanding of an issue has changed over the course of your work. Surveys and interviews with partners is a great way to follow up at the end of your project and get some feedback. So kind of a whole range of things, from very formal processes to some informal. You can collect these things on your own if you're kind of aware of and thinking about what do I need to know to demonstrate some of this evidence of change. So I think a few of you actually did mention some of those pieces of evidence in our earlier chat, but if you have some other ideas, again, what we're presenting are some ideas and some examples, and not a complete list of possibilities. So if you have other ideas or other experience, please drop them in. And Gigi, I'm going to keep going and let you take on this next bit because we're close to our hour.
Sounds good. Okay, so the next part to think about as part of your impacts, so again, it's important to understand what changed, but then to identify and specifically call out for whom did things change. So in this case study, in terms of connectivity, those community members and city planners and emergency members strengthen their ties with one another. In addition, it's important to understand how you yourself as the researcher were impacted as your ties with these groups were created and strengthened. Regarding capacity building, city government officials were impacted in many ways. One example was that the Floodsville City staff members were able to learn GIS skills to map flood projections, so they all learned a new skill set. Under instrumental impacts, the city government officials were the ones who were changed through by changing their operations for hazard mitigation. And then conceptual impacts, in this case, both city council and community members gained new knowledge about flooding issues. And again, maybe you know that because at the community and city council meetings, people asked you increasingly in-depth questions about the impacts that they might face and use this information to think about new ways that they would prepare for floods. So calling out who are you impacting, there's multiple ways to kind of categorize for whom things changed or improved because of your research. These are some common categories: your stakeholders and community partners, policymakers, practitioners, officials. Another category might be students that you're working with, K through 12, undergrads, graduates, or continuing education folks. And then maybe it's a general public, so residents of a city or interested stakeholder parties. And then across all of these categories, depending on the research that you're doing, it can also be really important to recognize and understand some of the demographics of the people who are impacted. So how are you actually reaching, the people and the communities that you hope to reach? So back in the case of Floodsville, if the community members or the community that you were working with were part of the city that had been historically ignored or left out of city policies or had been consistently underfunded by the city, the impact of building those relationships between city planners and community members in that case becomes even more of a significant outcome.
Okay, we are going to dive into a slightly more free-form part of this. As Gigi talked about at the beginning, one of the things we want to encourage some thinking about, mostly as reflective practice, is to see if what kinds of inputs and how the context in which you're doing your research influenced everything that happened afterward. And this can just really help you think about how to plan what worked and why it worked this time and how you might be able to build on that and plan for that in the future. So thinking about the inputs that went into your project and how that may have then influenced everything that happened. So in this case, the research team had the knowledge and capacity to provide the kind of data that the city needed. So that was important. They had the expertise to do this. They had some funding, both for research, and they had some support for the engagement part of this. And that's a really important one to think about because too often, unfortunately, that's the piece that's missing, is the support to go to those meetings, to spend the extra time talking with folks. So if you have that additional support, it's really important to call that out. It's a key part of the plan. And the researchers, as we mentioned, had worked previously with the city emergency managers. So they already had a little bit of a foundation underneath them. That again helps things spin up a little bit faster. So thinking about those, how your project inputs influence your project impacts. Context is really important too. So in this case, we had a flood event that really catalyzed action in the city and in the neighborhoods. Community members were motivated. They were sort of driving some of this process. They wanted some answers others as well. And the city was making it a priority. They were sort of acting on this. And so there was sort of a policy window open to make some changes because the city had prioritized this. So these are all things that influence the way that your project works out. So when you're thinking about writing that case study, you're not necessarily going to report on all of those, but it's good reflective practice to think back on them and think about how some of those underlying issues may have influenced and helped your ability to get those impacts. Okay, so one last note on these long-term impacts. If you're able to engage and stay engaged and see these impacts in the long term, great. So here we go, Floodsville, we're looking 25 years in the future. The sea level did rise, but there was no flooding in that vulnerable part of Floodsville. Floodsville saved billions of dollars because they were able to build the appropriate kind of seawall. So if you have long-term monitoring, or you happen to maybe stay living in Floodsville and you get to follow this throughout your entire career, you might get to see that. But going back to the idea of those short and midterm indicators, you could feel a lot more confident that you really contributed towards this great long-term outcome because you have evidence of change in the short and medium term. Okay, we've shown you this logic model and walked you through a format, and we're going to show you a little sort of case study reporting sheet. But one of the points that I want to make is that none of this is carved in stone. These should be definitely seen as tools and some language to help you describe your work. I'm using this little metaphor here because sometimes you'll hear sculptors talk about the image emerges from the stone, they can't impose it upon it. So I think we talked a little bit, somebody mentioned, sometimes you have a great plan going in and things do change. Yeah, they do, and that's sort of the messy, wonderful part of doing this kind of work. What we were hoping to do is just provide a tool, some framework, and some language to help you crystallize some of those conversations and some of the thinking about this. But this is not a paint by numbers, so you've got to adapt this tool to make it work for the kind of work that you're doing. But we're hoping this just gives you a good boost or a good foundation along the way.
So the handouts that I sent yesterday that are associated with today's workshop include a longer version of this worksheet that you see here. And it goes through the same steps that we went through in a more linear format. And so it can help provide the guidance to develop your own research impact case study. So we hope you'll take that and work through some of your own projects with that guidance, and also feel free to reach out to us and give us feedback on how it works for you, or contact us if you have questions as you're going through it.
I'm going to take one last quick question from Anna. Does this have an expiration date? If you hope to have this big instrumental change, and we know that that can take a long time, how long can you keep track? There's the aspiration of, as an evaluator, I would say, you want to keep track forever. But the reality is that programs don't have that. So you might be able to think about periodically checking back in on certain things. So if you can do this kind of the tracking during the lifespan of your project and kind of keep on top of that and have some of that early evidence of change, if you have the capacity to pop back in at maybe on a yearly time step, phone up those folks that you were working with, see how things are going. If you have that capacity, that's a great way. You've already got the bulk of your work done, and now maybe you're just adding a little bit and a little bit over time. That's just making your reporting or making your thinking about this a little more robust over time. And I'd say you do that for as long as you have the capacity to do it. Sometimes if you are in the same place and engaged with the same folks, you get to see something really long-term play out. You don't always have that possibility. Maybe this format helps you feel like you're walking away still with some nice evidence and a feeling that you've had an impact.
And I'll just add to that, one thing that I do with CLEMAS is I have various things attached to like Google Google searches or Google news updates. So every week or as things come in, I'll get like somehow somewhere a report was used in some kind of thing, and so that can be like a really good way to hear about something that you might have been involved with, and then if you still have those connections, be able to call up and be like, have a conversation about it so you can get some more detail. But that's one very specific way that I've tracked things from, years prior.
Yeah, to the extent that you can automate it, I think that's great. Okay, in the interest of time, I think Gigi mentioned at the beginning we can make the slides available because we do have a few resources if this has piqued your interest, some other ideas out there, and we'll save a recording of this. And we also would love to invite everybody to join us. One advantage of everything being canceled this spring is that this wonderful conference, Advancing Research Impacts in Society, has been moved entirely online, and the cost has come way down. It is $50 for 3 days worth of presentations on topics similar to today. So if it's something that you're interested in, check it out and join us online. And I think we are really
there's one last question if you want.
Sorry. Go ahead, Gigi.
It says, if you're engaged in many projects with the same stakeholder communities, how do you disentangle which project contributed how much and not triple count impacts?
Oh, that's a good one. That can actually be really challenging to say, to attribute, exactly this little pot of money did this little pot of money did this. If you're able to do some setup at the beginning and think about that logic model at the beginning, you might have one of those pots of money is a little bit more focused perhaps on supporting the workshop part of your project. And so you might be able to kind of disentangle a little bit that way versus another of those grants is supporting the research effort. Another of the grants is supporting another part of that. So you might be able to sort of start to line that out at the beginning. You definitely don't want to triple count, but you can also simply make some statements some transparency statements at the beginning of reports to say, hey, this was actually I actually was able to draw on multiple sources of support in order to produce these. And I think that's another nice bit of sort of transparency, and and it's fair. You don't want to triple count, but just to say this was a cumulative impact, if you will, of all of these things coming together.
Great. Should we switch
up? Oh, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
So I think we are going to end the sort of outward formal presentation here. We will post the video and we can send out the slides. So keep an eye on your email and we'll send that information the next few days. We do have some folks who have signed on to stay for a little bit of an informal discussion. So if you are one of those folks, stay on the line. And for everyone else, thank you so much for joining us today. And feel free to drop us questions that come up afterward, and we'll do our best to answer you and give you some new